Hey guys, welcome or welcome back. Tisha here, back with another chapter reading a memoir, Shattered Dreams, My Life as a Polygamous Wife. If I tell you how many times I did this intro alone, you wouldn't believe me. My tripod is acting up today, and I got to this full first section on one page, and then I noticed that you all were seeing something that you didn't need to see. We don't want to make this X-rated. So go ahead, do me a favor, hit the like button as we begin chapter 2. A teaching that was to have a grave impact on how I live my life can be summed up quite simply as follows. People fail the principle, but the principle itself never fails. The way it was put to us was really more like a challenge, even a dare. Plural marriage will damn people more than it saves, precisely because so few who attempt it will be able to live up to such a high calling. When families splintered, when spouses delved into unrighteousness, when children of the covenant lacked the courage to live polygamy for themselves, it was always the fault of human weakness and sin, never a problem with the principle, which is one of the things that makes this thing so dangerous because there's no system in place to check this thing. It's just, if you do this, then you'll get here. If you don't, then you'll be there. Over the years, in a great variety of ways, we saw so many of our number fail, some of them our own parents, or worse still, our leaders. The odd effect on me and on many others was to make us resolve all the harder to be among those who prevailed. If glory was that hard to attain, it must be well worth having. Besides, what was our alternative? I was too young to comprehend the problems among my father and his 4 wives, but soon after I started kindergarten, my mother moved out of the fourplex. A short time later, both Aunt Rhea and Aunt Rachel also left Dad. Yes, even Aunt Rhea. Oh, so things must have been bad if her Aunt Rhea, who was supposed to be the devout one, left. At my age, it was baffling to me why 3 of our 4 mothers suddenly left. Years later, when I tried to find out why, Mother admitted to me that Dad had a drinking problem. This, along with his inability to support them financially or meet any of their emotional or physical needs, forced Rachel, Rhea, and Mother to move out and struggle on alone. Wow. So he had a drinking problem and these ladies left, but where did they go once they left? After the conversation with Mother, she never talked that much about Dad to me, except to make sure I remembered about his drinking problem and also that I knew he swore and smoked. If he couldn't even keep the word of wisdom, how could he expect to become a god, Mother said. That's true because they're making it into the kingdom is contingent upon him. So that would be a problem if he's not doing what he's supposed to do. Which is why, if you look at the sister wives, I don't understand why those women were attached to Cody when he wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. But I shall continue. My father had violated those relatively minor rules, even while living the higher and harder law of polygamy. I regretted that I never got to know my father any better. It was terribly lonely to be raised without him. I needed his love and acceptance. When my mother left him, I was torn between him and my loyalty to her. After that, I didn't get to see him very often, and when I did, I was afraid of him. The most vivid recollection I have of my father was the time he picked me up at our little rented house after work and took me to spend the night with him and Ellen. Of his wives, she alone had elected to stay with him. I was barely 6, and without Mother there, I was too frightened to eat much supper. Dad must have sensed my discomfort because he allowed me to sleep in his big brass bed with him and Aunt Ellen. He hugged me, telling me how special I was. Don't ever forget me, Rensky. I know your name is Irene, but you'll always be my Rensky. Come visit your old man whenever you can. He held me close as I fell asleep in his arms. I'll never forget that night. I came halfway out of a deep sleep, sensing something warm and wet. Then I heard Dad's angry shouts. Damn it, Ellen, get this kid out of here. She pissed all over me. He shoved me out of the bed. Hell's sakes, Ellen, put this kid on the damn pot, he yelled as he jumped up and went to the kitchen to heat some water so he could take a bath. I could still hear him grumbling. I've got to leave for work by 5 o'clock. I get it. She had an accident, but don't make the kid feel worse by doing all of that. Accidents happen, especially at that age. It's not what you want to happen, but did you not wake her up in the middle of the night? Did you not make sure she went to the bathroom before she, went to sleep? Like, it's not all on her. Aunt Ellen warily slipped off the wet panties that clung to my bottom. I was groggy and could hardly move, but I hoped to escape Dad's further wrath by letting her place me on the chamber pot. We still don't have an operational indoor toilet. Wow. I had to hold myself carefully over the 2-gallon chamber so the stifling stuff inside wouldn't touch my bum. Well, no wonder she didn't go to the potty. She had to. I wouldn't have went either. It seems like the bed was a better option. I tried hard to balance myself, but somehow, oh no, the whole stinking pot tipped over and spilled in all directions. Oh. I could do nothing but sprawl right in the middle of the awful mess. I was horrified. God, hell! Ellen, get that damn kid in here. Wash her off in my bath water so I can take her home before I'm late for work. On the way back to my mother's, I hardly said a word. I couldn't even look at him. I thought Dad didn't like me anymore. He must have noticed my quivering lip because he reached in his pocket and gave me a quarter. My deep longings for a father soon began to fade. After all the covenants my mother and Dad had made to one another before God and angels, plus 1 or 2 witnesses, it was dire poverty that finally eroded their commitment. That and Dad's inability to meet Mother's most profound needs as a woman. According to a journal I found many years later after her death, this failure broke my mother's heart. She tried to live polygamy but found her life joyless in it, waiting for her turn alongside Dad's other 3 wives. Mother found her time with him was too limited. His passions were spent by the time he came to her door. His emotions were consumed by alcohol before he came to see any of them. Mother was afraid of him, even while she yearned for him. It's crazy the things that these women go through. Sometimes she wondered why God didn't want women and children to be happy too. My mother lived in a religious no-win situation. She was devoted to a tradition that defeated her, and she passed this dilemma along to us. Though she loved the Mormon church, it was out of order, she said. It ceased to proclaim God's law of polygamy, and this not only confused people about God's requirements for exaltation, but it also left the faithful in the lurch. Perhaps the church's failure even contributed to the downfall of some like her and Dad, who couldn't quite get to the polygamy finish line despite years of sacrifice and struggle. Mormons who rejected the LDS manifestos of 1890 and 1904 were instructed to bear all the children they could and thereby multiply the numbers of the faithful. But no one seemed to much consider who would support these abundant offspring. Each man married whomever he could persuade to become a producing member of his family kingdom, and each wife then set about fulfilling her maternal role. Not to worry, God would provide. This is ridiculous. That's why so much poverty was around back then. But far too often, God came in the form of country and state welfare. With 6 young children to raise, my mother was forced to live on welfare for 8 years after leaving Dad. Her heart ached that she could never give us the things she thought we needed. Mother tried unsuccessfully for several years to get an official release, a divorce, from Dad, but this could only be done by the priestholder who married them in the first place. This man told Mother he'd gladly release her, but only on the condition she marry him instead. What kind of crap is that? So you need to be released, but the only way you can be released is if you marry me? My goodness. It didn't take her 2 seconds to realize she'd rather be single forever. forever because in heaven she'd be an angel instead of a goddess. Then marry this disgusting, obese old man. It had been unbearable enough being wife number 2. Why now stoop to being the 7th wife of a high priest? Soon after she first left him, Dad came and pled with Mother to take him back. She was so painfully lonely that in a moment of weakness, she finally agreed, and she returned to the fourplex. Because these women have been taught nothing else, because a lot of them don't feel like they can make it out on their own, they do this. It seems like they leave and come back a lot, or they're forced back. This lasted for only a short time. Not many months later, Mother was alone again, now pregnant with her 6th child. All of my mother's pregnancies were rough. She often spent a month or more confined to her bed, trying not to miscarry. As every delivery approached, she feared she would die. Aunt Rhea was the one whose nurturing and gentle coaching helped Mother pull through each painful ordeal. Afterward, while Mother recuperated, the custom then was for the women to lie in bed for 10 days after giving birth. Aunt Rhea would bathe her and rub lotion on her arms and legs. It's interesting because despite what they're going through, it seems like those sister wives kind of looked out for each other. But let's see. The tender treatment she received from Aunt Rhea gave her license at times to pretend she was weaker than she was and incapable of resuming her duties. A situation Dad generally responded to with impatience, which made Mother feel even more alone and more rejected by him. Soaking in the loving attention Aunt Rhea showered on her, she resented the fact that her own husband never rubbed or caressed her and rarely touched her at all. So this woman is longing so much for a loving touch that someone else taking care of her feels good to her because her husband won't do it. But she's good enough to lay with and keep impregnating. Goodness gracious. Mother often felt her sister Rhea was the only person who really loved her. With no Aunt Rhea down the hall, no vitamins, and what little nourishment she could get after her welfare checks were spent on us, Mother's final pregnancy thoroughly taxed her naturally thin, frail frame. She somehow carried my sister Irma to term. The baby was delivered by cesarean section at the county hospital in May 1943. It had been 4 years since Mother delivered her last child. Irma was a cute, red-faced doll who won her heart instantly. Mother doted on her and immediately repented of ever thinking the pregnancy had been a mistake. But when she thought about caring for her new daughter, desperation enveloped her. Mother was a dreamer who never made peace with her life. I remember her as a multi-talented person, a singer, therapist, seamstress, poet, and teacher. I remember her as a servant, always doing for others when she had any energy at all to spare. But to her own children, she was distant and inaccessible, caught up with regrets about how things might have been, caught up with her poverty and isolation and need. At times she got depressed, and then we had her even less. My brothers and sisters and I felt she'd abandoned us. Perhaps not as much as Dad had, but she emotionally abandoned us just the same. Wow. In July 1944, state and federal authorities arrested 19 men throughout Utah for the practice of plural marriage. My father was one of them. The raid was intended to stop polygamy by making an example of these men. This was the biggest crackdown on polygamists in decades, and the state of Utah said its actions were necessary to curb abuse of women, children, and welfare agencies. Soaring numbers of applications for government aid came in from women claiming to be single moms, but who continually turned up pregnant. Girls as young as 14 were bearing children by men old enough to be their fathers. Yeah, that's sick. Polygamy was on the rise, and something needed to be done. At the tender age of 7, I appeared with a large group of polygamous families in a double-page photo spread in Life magazine. The story was so unusual. The editors gave it prime placement. Not since the 1890s, as far as anyone could remember, had a national publication addressed the oddity of American polygamy. Among those arrested, 15 signed a statement promising to abandon their plural wives and practice of polygamy, and these men were released. My father and 3 other staunch believers refused, determined to sit in jail forever if necessary, rather than make bastards of most of their children. Dad, with only one wife, still willing to live with him, said he remained committed to the laws of God, including polygamy. The polygamists who signed the statements mostly went right on to practicing polygamy, apparently undaunted by the arrest and their own disavowals, though perhaps a little less esteemed by the surprised rest of us. But Dad and his 3 steadfast friends, who did exactly what we all expected them to do, spent 2.5 years in the Utah State Prison. He called it Crowbar College. Mother was never allowed to visit Dad inside the prison because she wasn't legally married to him. Only Aunt Rhea, his legal wife, could go in. But Mother once took her children to see him anyway, hoping for a miracle that would gain us entrance. She persuaded a friend to drive us to the prison grounds on Visitor's Day. Once there, while other families went in and out, she waited with all 6 of us in the crowded parking lot. When Dad finally came into the prison yard with the other convicts, we watched as she led little Irma over to the fence to meet her dad for the very first time. That is some stuff. That is some stuff. I remember him stooping down with tears streaming down his anguished face and putting a quarter through the squares in the wire to coax little Irma to let him kiss her. Mother then scooped Irma up in her arms and walked rapidly toward the car before Dad could see that she was crying too. He was the only love she'd ever known, but in order to survive, she needed to quit loving him and move on with her life. She learned that the desire brings pain with it, so she vowed never to desire a man again. Y'all. The long ride home that afternoon seemed to take forever. None of us frightened kids said a word as Mother sat beside us, weeping silently all the way. I was 12 when Mother applied for homestead rights in an arid, sparsely settled region near the Utah-Nevada border called Trout Creek. The homesteading program involved the receipt of 150 undeveloped acres in Utah sticks in exchange for nothing but a commitment to improve them. Mother planned to farm on our homestead, though we later discovered it was too sandy to sustain much in the way of vegetation. All the water with which we tried to irrigate disappeared instantly into the deep sand, sinking too quickly to be grabbed up by seeds or roots near the surface. Our farm was like a giant sieve, but Mother, who had by this time settled for a civil divorce from Dad, granted on the basis of her being a common law wife, felt she finally had to get away from Salt Lake City and focus her attention on her neglected children. At first, Trout Creek seemed like the place to do it. Aunt Rhea was always worried that my mother was relying on me too heavily around the house and yet depriving me of proper religious instruction and example. Instead, I come to live with her and her 7 children for the school year. Having obtained the official release from my father that my mother had been unable to get, 2 different elders married the 2 sisters of my father. Rhea was now living in Farmington, Utah, a little north of Salt Lake. I was there when Mother moved to Trout Creek with my sisters, Becky and Irma. My brothers had already left home. Roger was married and living in Salt Lake City. Douglas and Richard worked as hired hands on a ranch some 30 miles away. During the Christmas holidays that year, Mother came to see me. I was so homesick. I prevailed upon her to let me go back with her to Trout Creek so I could be a part of her fresh start in life. Mr. Walter Farber began building Mother a 2-bedroom frame home on her sandy property. He was a former Mormon who brought his family to Trout Creek to found some sort of new religious sect, though not a polygamous one. My mother accepted his tremendous generosity as a neighborly kindness. As for her land, Mother was determined to clear a piece of it herself with a borrowed tractor and at least plant a large vegetable garden. By the time I arrived, she and my 11-year-old sister Becky had already dug a well to supply the new homestead. They had to excavate 14 feet before finally reaching water. Wow, that's deep. While Mother's house was being built, we moved in with the Farber family, and I enrolled in Parton School, the only 7th grader in one-room secondary school. When summer came, I was able to get work at a ranch owned by Chet and Nelda Young, acquaintances of my brothers. I tended the Youngs' 5 children and helped with the house cleaning. Their ranch was about 90 miles from Trout Creek, so I didn't see my family the entire summer. At the end of it, I came home with $100 in my pocket, and I finally got to move into our brand new house. $100 for the whole summer. I guess that seemed like a lot back then. When I saw my sister Becky, I took her in my arms and cried. Just being together in our own home was heaven. We were 6 hours west of Salt Lake City in the middle of nowhere, and I was ready to be a family again. I miss my 3 older brothers, but at least I had Becky and Irma and my mother. Still just 13, I yearned for the comfort and security of some togetherness after all the ways our family had been torn apart over the years. That first night, I helped out with the chores until the warm autumn sun went down, and then I retired to gab with my sisters. Becky begged me to sleep outside with her where we could talk and have our privacy, and Mother happily gave her consent. Since 7-year-old Irma was still rather shy around me, I insisted she be included. Snuggling up close together while we slept would give us a chance to express the sisterly love we felt for each other. Becky helped me pull the old blue and white striped mattress out of the metal bed in our room. We puffed along dramatically as we dragged the unwieldy thing across the yard, stopping often to rest. And then we giggled like idiots when we finally dropped it in among the sagebrush about 30 yards from the house. The sagebrush might at least muffle our voices and laughter. We slipped into our nighties and tucked our clothes under the foot of the mattress. Settling in for bed. Soon it was pitch black except for a dazzling spray of stars across the desert sky. Oh, I love looking at stars at night with no city lights, which is, rare in some places, but I love it. One thing kept nagging at me and preventing me from sleeping. Earlier in the evening, a neighbor from a nearby ranch showed up for a visit. I took an instant disliking to him, mostly because of how he kept his eyes glued on my mother. I just knew his supposed friendship with her was really about what the Bible calls lust. Yeah, you're not building no house for somebody if it's the same neighbor, just two. You want something out of this deal. He also laughed too loud with an awful bray, was ugly and unkempt, and when he wasn't looking hungrily at Mother, he flirted his eyes about the room in a manner I found, shifty. Furthermore, when I gave him blatant hints to leave, he'd ignore them, showing a total lack of manners. He was still inside with Mother when we gathered on the mattress outside. I felt uneasy about the whole thing. Yes, Mother was 40 years old, but could she keep this fellow in line? I well knew no man could be fully trusted except for the brethren who held the priesthood and made a covenant with God to live in plural marriage. Horus Nielsen, still a bachelor at 48, couldn't possibly qualify. He wasn't even a fundamentalist. According to Brigham Young, who had at least 27 wives, any young man who is unmarried at the age of 21 is a menace to the community. A man at 21? That's why at 18 they start getting married, because if they're not done by 21, it's a problem. It's like you set these people up for failure, because how much do you know of yourself at that young of an age that the men are 18 when they can start being a priesthood, and the girls are even younger than that, and then they're expected to have wives by 21? A man had to be responsible and get married, taking many wives in order to bring God's special spirits into the world. If Horus loved the Lord, why didn't he have at least 6 wives and 30 or more kids by now? I lay on my stomach talking to Becky. Every once in a while, I raise up and squint into the darkness to try to see if Horus' old green Chevy was still in our yard. Becky tried to convince me it was gone, but I sure hadn't heard it leave. I got more indignant by the minute. Mother was going to have to take a few cues from me. From now on, she'd have to put her foot down and tell Horus to stay away. After all, the scriptures said to avoid the very appearance of evil. She's sitting here looking out for her mom. Kids have a way of knowing when something's off. Getting drowsy, I surrendered the whole matter after a while. But I bolted wide awake when I heard coyotes howling in the distance. Ooh, excuse me. I can't read this late again because I'm yawning left and right. Sorry, y'all. Becky and Irma assured me we were safe, that they heard the howling all the time, and I finally dozed off into a dreamless sleep. I awoke to the biting chill of the morning air, slipping into my sandals. I headed for the outhouse while my sister still slept. Parked on the cold, unplanned seat, I wondered how many people left this privy with silvers in their butts. I giggled, then caught myself. I was being silly and light-minded again. Many a well-meaning friend or relation brought this fault to my attention. I tried to overcome it, asking God many times to forgive me, but somehow he'd never cured me. Shivering, I ran back to bed and crawled in between the girls. When I saw smoke rising from the tin pipes of the kitchen stove, I grabbed my bundle of wrinkled clothes from under the mattress and slipped into my blouse and jeans. Then I started toward the house. Unable to talk me into staying outside with them, Becky and Irma, still in their nightgowns, raced behind me. As I approached the kitchen, the familiar aroma of Mother's hot cakes made my mouth water. I burst through the door yelling, "I get the first ones before the stove gets too hot." There sat, bald-headed, disheveled Horus in front of a half-eaten stack of Mother's prime pancakes, smothered with butter and her homemade syrup. And there sat Mother right beside him. Oh, goodness. As if that weren't enough, Horus had the nerve to invite me to sit down and have breakfast in my own home. I was undone. I hated him. Horus, that horse ass. He had gone too far. I looked him in the eye like a snake about to strike. I usually tried not to be mean to anybody, but at Horus that morning, I let swear words fly out of my mouth that I'm ashamed now to repeat. He got the message. Oh, she let him hear it? Oh, she's bold. He looked at Mother as though he expected her to stick up for him, but she wasn't prepared to take sides. Then he got up slowly and went out to his car without a word. Mother looked like she wanted to cry, but she scolded me instead. I can't believe a daughter of mine would talk like that. Horus' motor revved a few times out in the front of the house. Mother took the cue. She ran out the door and climbed in beside him. What? Okay, I'm side-eyeing the mom. Not that I agree with what she did, but your daughter just had that reaction, and rather than checking it out, you're leaving with the man. She climbed in beside him. As they pulled away, she called out, "I'm going to Nielsen's ranch. I'll be back later." Horus and his siblings owned the ranch, such as it was. After they left, neither Becky nor Irma said a thing. Though too angry to eat, I did cook up the remaining batter for my sisters. After that, I put a bucket of water on the stove to heat for the dishes, stripped everything from the cupboards, and scrubbed all the shelves. Then I rearranged the dishes in an orderly fashion, all while seething. As Becky and Irma wisely stayed out of my way, I accomplished even more over the next 2 hours. I swept the ever-present sand out of the kitchen and living room and mopped the gold and white linoleum beneath to a perfect shine. Then I shook out the two shag throw rugs and placed them back in front of each door so we could at least wipe our feet before tracking the sand and dust inside. I took two galvanized pails out to the well where an old leaky bucket with a big metal bolt wired onto one side was tied by a rope to a round wooden winch. I lowered the antique contraption into the well six times in order to fill my two pails. Back in the house, I carefully placed the pails of clean, fresh water side by side on the counter next to the sink. I'd done a lot more work than I started out to do. Finally, I heard a car drive up. I glanced out the kitchen window and saw Mother getting out of Horus's Chevy. Still furious, I worried about facing him again and what I might say. Through the open screen, I heard Mother ask, "Should I just tell her?" What? Use your own judgment, Olive. By the time they got to the kitchen door, I jerked it open and squared off against the both of them. "Tell me what?" It's in all caps. I demanded. I was already pretty headstrong back then, though I didn't realize it at the time. Mother whispered apologetically, "Irene, don't be so angry, please. I wanted to tell you last night." She faltered, "But I didn't know how. Horus and I are married." What? That's how you tell your daughter? You don't even have a discussion? You just fling this man upon her that makes her feel uncomfortable? Oh boy, this is gonna be this gonna be a book, y'all. Cause we only on page we only on chapter 2, and I feel away. I saw it all in an instant. They deceived me, every one of them, not just Mother and Horus, but Becky and Irma too. So much for our private little slumber party under the stars. It was Mother and Horus who needed the privacy, and they needed it from me. My sisters had simply been their pawns. Whom could I trust now? My eyes burned, my vision blurred. I whirled around, bolted out the door, and took off running through the fields, through the mesquites and sage, running faster and faster, trying to gain momentum to escape. My grand homecoming, the fresh start we waited for and worked for, was a mirage. Mother had gone off and married a monogamist, and a creepy one at that. I kept right on running. I was gasping for breath and my legs ached, but I pushed myself further until I found a large tree growing out of a sand dune. I prostrated myself face down in the shade of its branches and sobbed. I howled and I cursed. Finally, I begged God to be kind and let me die. She must have really been feeling a lot of pain, and she must have really been uncomfortable with that man if she begged to die. For hours, I lay there in the sand as the shade disappeared. The midday sun beat down on me and drenched my blouse with sweat. Perversely, I enjoyed the discomfort. During my long repose, I thought about my whole life. I didn't like the sad, lonely childhood I saw as I reflected. Now I couldn't wait to be grown up. If God wouldn't let me die, perhaps he'd bring along a worthy man one day who would take me out of this mess. And that's part of the problem, because a lot of these girls are so unhappy at home that they look for a way out. And unfortunately, that way to them is through a man. He'd have to be a man who would love me the way a woman ought to be loved, the way my mother should have been, but never was, and probably never would be. Maybe with such a man, I would finally feel secure. I lost my mother, and I was even confused about the principal. 13-year-olds has never been so lonely. The following summer, I was glad to get away from Trout Creek and work again for Chet and Nelda Young at their ranch near Milford, Utah. Over the 3 summers I eventually spent with them, the Youngs were always wonderful to me. They offered a family atmosphere in which I felt love. Nelda taught me the things my mother neglected, partially because mother didn't do them herself. Mother was a terrible housekeeper and cook, but Nelda showed me how to make homemade bread and butter, cook and mend and hand stitch and darn stockings. She even taught me how to separate dirty clothes into light and dark batches in order to keep the whites bright, a finer point of laundering with which mother never bothered. At first, it seemed Nelda constantly had to make me redo things I'd mess up, but she patiently trained me that first year, and then they invited me back again for 2 more summer stints. In the end, I must have done something right. Mostly it was Nelda, though. I couldn't have asked for a better teacher. The education that she gave me prepared me for raising my own family. While we worked, Nelda helped me memorize hymns. I gained new confidence in my singing. They didn't ostracize me for my fundamentalism, but their example of another way was just one more factor contributing to my religious questioning around this time. Back at Trout Creek, my mother was just as glad I was gone for the summer. She figured it would solve a lot of problems. I knew before she did that her marriage was a big mistake. Horus was what we called a Jack Mormon. One only in name. He practiced no religion, was completely unspiritual. It showed in his life. As it turns out, the reason mother married Horus was not love, but cancer. Oh, wow. She'd been feeling bad for a long time, and the doctors who finally diagnosed her told her she didn't have long to live. She kept this from everyone. Desperate not to leave her children in the hands of any welfare agency, however, she married Horus. Trapped out on his family ranch with nothing but brothers and sisters and crops for company, he homed in on her the moment she arrived in Trout Creek. She accepted his pushy marriage proposal without really knowing him, hoping that when the time came, he at least proved superior to foster care. She didn't tell her children about her cancer until much later, after she miraculously conquered the disease. So he's all these things, and you were willing to leave him with your child rather than want to like split them up with your sister wives or something like that. I don't know. But she was cured, or conquered it. In the meantime, Horus proved an even lousier parent than he was a husband. He resented mother's kids, and we resented him. His childish, hurtful antics shock me even now. For example, he put all sorts of silly restrictions on the food we could eat, though he served himself royally. He also wouldn't let mother buy us clothes we needed, even with her own money. And when mother got her certification through a correspondence course and began teaching school, he suffered so from the loss of her constant attention that he apparently determined he wouldn't share her with us at all. That's when we went from childish to abusive. Once during this time, little Irma was burning up with a fever. Horus came in and found mother rocking her gently in our old wooden rocker. With no warning at all, he jerked Irma out of mother's arms and shoved her, sending her sprawling across the sandy floor. "You leave my woman alone, you hear?" he bellowed. "She's mine." How can you say that to a kid about their mom? What kind of weirdo? For the first time, hate filled mother's eyes. After that, Horus frequently sent my sisters outside so he could get mother all to himself. She began to realize why I instinctively hated the man. Turns out she traded polygamy for a lethal possessiveness. Horus worked many miles away on an assembly line at the Tool Ordnance Depot. He would wear his steel-toed work shoes home. Once when he came in and found little Irma hugging mother, he knocked her away and commenced kicking her with the shoes on until mother finally fought him off. He liked to pick on Irma because she was the easiest target. This breaks my heart. Once when I was there, he tried pulling the same sort of tantrum on me. It wasn't long before he ordered me out of his house, but I stood my ground as always. Your house, I yelled. Hell, this is our house. Mother built this house. If you were any kind of man, you build your own house. You're all just bastards, he screamed, starting to get up out of his chair to come at me. Oh, y'all. I was at the stove, stirring the coals with a poker at the time. I whirled around, brandishing my red-hot sword in his face. You better take that back, I yelled. I like her. Irene, I like you, girl. You got spunk. He went ashen. He flailed his arms about, almost falling off the chair as it tipped back against the wall. Don't, he pleaded. Then he yelled, Olive, Olive. Luckily for him, Mother came running. Irene, stop it. That's enough, she ordered. Mother was even more afraid of Horus than she'd been of my father. Some nights, Becky and I could hear him through the wall, beating her. She'd cry out, begging him to stop, but he went right on hurting her. I seen her bruises the next morning, and I'd plead with him to leave her alone, to no avail. For the time being, Mother was determined to live with her mistake. Once I found her crying on her bed, and she told me it was because she failed so miserably at the beautiful principle of polygamy. She made me a promise I wouldn't tell Aunt Rhea what she'd done, marrying Horus. How could I possibly refuse her? It was so awful living there with him that Becky and I often ran away from home. Neighbors would take us in for a few weeks at a stretch. Most of them had known our stepfather a long time. They understood. But Mother always found us eventually and brought us back, probably telling herself it was the best thing for us. I began to yearn for a different home. And that's where I'm going to end it. You guys, this book, I think, is going to push us a little bit because she's not wasting any time to tell us some of the crap. And I just feel bad for the kids. I know it's hard to leave situations like that when you feel like you're up against the wall, but it just goes to show you how much this particular religion really binds these women and keeps them bound and has them in situations that just seem to get worse and worse. And unfortunately, some part of her mother probably felt like she deserved the treatment that she was getting. But you all let me know what you thought of this chapter. See you guys on Thursday for the chapter reading.